Chapter 39. Anna was putting the baby to bed when somebody knocked. At first, she didn't even know where the sound came from. They rarely had visitors now, and never bought anything that required delivery. She frowned and went into the kitchen. The knock came again, and she went warily down the stairs to the front door. It was DCI Marvel. The shoulders of his coat were damp, even though it was no longer raining. It made her wonder how long he'd been out, or how far he had walked.
"Mrs. Buck," he said, "I need to speak to you." He was drunk. Not rolling drunk, but she could tell.
Anna stared at him. He looked unwell. His face was pale and his eyes were red and tired, although that might have been from the cigarette smoke that curled up into them on this damp, windless night. But there was something else in his eyes that told her that refusing him entry was not going to work.
"James will be home soon," she said cautiously.
"That's okay."
He shrugged and stepped forward, so she stepped backwards, and all of a sudden he was in the house.
"I won't be long,"
he said, and looked up the stairs as if to remind her where they were supposed to be going.
"Can you take your shoes off, please?"
"Really?"
he said.
"I'm on official police business."
"Really?" she said, and he took off his shoes. She gestured for him to go first. On the way up the stairs, she noticed that his right sock had a hole in one heel.
"In here?"
he said at the kitchen.
"If you like,"
she said. He sat at the table and she put down a saucer for his ash.
"You've cleaned up the paint."
"Yes," said Anna. "It took a while." He looked around and said nothing. Anna knew she should offer him a cup of tea, but she didn't want to encourage him.
"So,"
she said bluntly,
"what do you want?"
He sat for a moment, silent, eyes narrowed by smoke.
"Earlier today, Richard Latham told me Edie Evans has been dead from the start."
He turned up his palms.
"I mean, I don't believe any of this psychic bullshit, but—"
He stopped. Anna didn't know what he wanted her to say, so she said,
"I'm sorry."
He nodded slowly and said, "Thank you," and Anna realized with surprise that he felt he deserved that sympathy, which somehow made him deserving of it.
"Would you like a cup of tea?" she asked.
"Please." She put the kettle on, and the little kitchen with the black windows was suffused with a subliminal thrum of water. They didn't speak again until she put 2 mugs on the table and sat down opposite Marvel.
"What made you think she wasn't dead?"
Marvel shook his head. He flushed. He was embarrassed, she could see.
"Just hope," he said. "But it felt more substantial than that. More rational."
He sipped his tea and cupped his hands loosely around the mug.
"Now it just seems a bit stupid."
Anna suddenly felt very close to DCI Marvel. He went on, slow and measured.
"Latham said she died a month or so after being taken. That means that all the time I've spent looking for her and thinking about her and wondering where she is and how she is, 15 months, has been a waste of time. Because she's fucking dead."
He threw up a hand and jolted tea out of his mug onto the table.
"Sorry,"
he said. Anna got a cloth and wiped up the spill.
"Your time wasn't wasted,"
she said.
"You don't think so?"
She looked into her tea.
"I think about Daniel all the time. I wonder how he is, what he's doing, whether he's thinking about me, how he's changing, how tall he is now, whether his clothes still fit him or whether someone has bought him new ones."
She caught her voice before it could break. and gave a tremulous smile at the bittersweet pleasure of her own imagination.
"Thinking about him keeps him alive for me," she said. "It gives me hope, and hope keeps me alive for him."
Marvel stared at her. He lit another cigarette. He used matches, not a lighter, and the delicious, dangerous smell of sulphur hung over them for a moment, before the dull and dirty smoke took over. He clamped the cigarette between his lips and leaned sideways so he could take something from the inside pocket of his coat. Anna averted her eyes. She knew what it would be.
"Please don't ask me to look at her picture," she said in a rush.
"Why not?"
"It hurts."
"How can it hurt?"
"I don't know, but it does. Here." She cupped her belly.
"Latham wouldn't look at it either," said Marvel, "even after I offered him a deal."
"But if you don't believe in psychic powers, what was the point of asking him to look at it?"
"I don't know," said Marvel irritably. "I don't know."
"Shit."
He sighed and leaned back in his chair, which creaked precariously. Then, after a moment, he said, "I do know. Latham's a lying son of a bitch, but he said something that stuck in my head. He said, 'Everybody gets there in the end.'"
"Gets where?" said Anna.
"I think he was talking about God."
"What does it mean?"
"I suppose it means that people want to believe in something. God, or Santa Claus, or some bloody thing. Even if it's just because they're scared and desperate."
Marvel deliberately put the curled photo of the dog show down on the table in front of Anna. He half laughed, but there was no pleasure in it.
"Well, now I'm desperate," he said. "I can't go another day not knowing what happened to Edie Evans. And if you don't understand that, then nobody can."
Anna looked at him with fierce calm.
"You can go another day, Mr. Marvel, and you will, whether I help you or not, whether anybody helps you or not. For as long as you live, you will go on, because the only alternative is not to."
The night on Bickley Bridge hung between them.
Then Marvel said, "Let me tell you something about this photo before you say no."
She nodded.
"Okay."
"This photo was taken last September, 8 months after Edie went missing."
Anna frowned, then looked suddenly hopeful.
"But that's good. That means Edie might be—"
"No, it doesn't," said Marvel. "Because you see this here?"
He pointed, and Anna glanced down obliquely.
"This is Edie's BMX bicycle, which we found at the crime scene, and which has been in the basement of Lewisham Police Station since January last year."
Anna frowned.
"But that's impossible."
Marvel shrugged.
"No, that's just improbable. You haven't heard the impossible bit yet." He took a breath. "Before I came here tonight, I went to see Sandra Clyde. I wanted to pick up the negative or digital file or whatever so we could enlarge the photo in the lab, get the best image to work with. Maybe identify other people in the picture, something to go on, you know."
Anna nodded. Marvel leaned forward. Then he stopped and sat up straight again and looked around the room as if he'd forgotten what he was going to say. Anna watched him closely. He looked more than drunk. He looked old. He looked confused. He looked scared. She felt fear trickle down her own spine.
"What?" she said. "What is it?"
Marvel looked at her and shook his head.
"Edie's not in the original photograph."
"I don't understand," said Anna.
He went on.
"And she's not in any of the other copies."
"What do you mean?"
Marvel's eyes met hers, and he spoke carefully. "Your photograph is the only one Edie's in." Anna's scalp prickled. I don't... Has it been...
Doctor tampered with, manipulated. Marvel shrugged. Our lab says no.
Then how? She said. How can that be?
Marvel slowly stubbed out his cigarette in the saucer.
That's the impossible bit.
Anna's hand made an involuntary movement towards the photo, but she stopped herself. She had to see, but she didn't want to look. Marvel spoke again, choosing his words carefully.
But it made me think of something else, Latham said to me. He said the dead are in control. He said the dead choose what they show, and who they show it to. And that made me think. Maybe Edie wanted to show these things to you. Maybe she knew you would be the best person to see what she wanted to show you, because of Daniel. Maybe that's why she knew you would pay attention. And maybe that's even why I stopped you jumping off Bickley Bridge. Shit, I don't know. It's crazy, and I'm drunk, and all I know for sure is that they're closing the case and abandoning Edie. And so now I'm ready to believe in something. In anything.
Anna flinched as Marvel took her hand, and she thought of Latham doing the same that night at the church, when she was the one doing the begging. He spoke in a desperate rush.
Please, Mrs. Buck, if she's dead, I want to know, but if she's alive, I have to find her, and you're my only hope. Please.
They sat at opposite sides of the small kitchen table, the impossible photograph between them, while the clock on the oven ticked quietly, and a bus pulled away from the stop outside. Finally, in a very small voice, Anna said, "Can you get me a glass of water, please?" James was rolling drunk, so he might have fallen over anyway. He took 2 strides into the kitchen in his socks and skidded over backwards with his feet in the air. The hand he put out to break his fall splashed down beside him like a belly flop from a high board. The kitchen was swimming in water. "Shit," he said as he lay on his back with his hair all cold and wet. He could hear water running from somewhere, so he stayed there, taking a moment to examine the ceiling for leaks, but it seemed to be fine. He wallowed about on his side and his elbows and his knees before finally getting back to his feet. The kitchen tap had been left open so far that the recoil was splashing the walls and the window. The plug wasn't in the sink, but despite that, the plug hole and the overflow had had no chance of coping with the sheer volume of water pounding down into it. "Fuck!" he said angrily, and paddled across the floor and turned off the tap. Then he looked around. Nothing else seemed to be wrong. The kitchen was otherwise as clean and tidy as it always was. "Anna!" he shouted. He crossed to the living room. So had the water, and the carpet was like a sponge. "Anna! Jesus Christ! Anna!" She was asleep in their bed, curled on her side with her knees drawn up. James tugged the covers off her. She was fully clothed and soaking wet. "Anna, what the bloody hell happened in the kitchen?" Anna woke slowly with a vacant look in her eyes. "What?" she said thickly. "What happened? In the kitchen?" Anna looked at the bedroom doorway, as if to remind herself where the kitchen was. "The police came," she told him, still not fully awake. "They wanted to read my mind." Chapter 40. Edie thought about taps. In particular, she thought about the garden tap, the one that leaked every summer when Dad put the hose pipe on it. Every summer was the same. Once the rain had stopped for long enough for the garden to need watering, Dad got the hose out of the shed and fixed it to the tap. Then every summer, he remembered, he hadn't fixed the tap. As soon as he turned it on, some water went in the hose pipe, but some water also came out of the handle where you turn the tap on. Every summer, Dad said, "Wash is gone. I'll have to fix that." Edie was 12, and she could remember that happening when she was 8, at least. So that was 4 years, 4 summers. 4 summers when water that should have been going down the hose pipe and to the flowers was instead bubbling out of the gaps in the metal and dribbling onto the concrete next to the house. Wasted. Curled up on the camp bed, Edie thought of that tap all the time. She thought of kneeling beside it and turning the handle and watching the water squeeze through the gaps. She thought of touching her tongue to the cold metal and feeling the tiny pressure of the flow on her tongue. She thought of waiting until her mouth was half full, and then opening her throat to allow the water to trickle gently down her gullet and into her stomach. She imagined the way it would feel spreading through her whole dry, wasting body, making her plump and strong and happy with water. Happy with water. She checked the jug again. It was dry. Her tummy cramped in want, and she dropped the jug and it broke into icy shards. Dry, icy shards. When she wasn't thinking about taps, Edie thought about Peter. She thought about her mouse often now. She thought that as soon as she was back home she would set him free. She'd only been here for a few weeks, or maybe months, it was hard to tell. But Peter had spent his whole life in a cage. He coped well with it. In many ways, Edie thought he would have made a better astronaut than she was. He ran in his wheel and he hid in his cardboard tubes and climbed his little ladders. He cleaned his whiskers and rubbed his tiny pink hands over his eyes in that way that made him look so cute and human. He burrowed into the clean shavings and made a nest, and chose the sunflower seeds first from his food bowl, before eating the pellets and then those weird yellow flakes. Peter kept himself busy. Edie raised her head a little and looked around the Spartan room. A bed, a poo bucket, a strip light, in a room that was barely bigger than a cupboard. Even Peter would have a hard time making much of it. She got off her bed and nearly fell. She was a lot more tired than the last time she had left it. She knelt and pulled the carrier bags from under the bed. There were great handfuls of black and brown and dark blue. The few reds and yellows were long gone, and Edie sifted through the rest, searching for the last stubs of maroon or purple. The sound of the crayons was comforting. A soft, hypnotic clicking as they rolled off her palms and tumbled back into the bags. For a while she just sat and did that, not really thinking about anything but the sound and the dull feel of the wax sticks falling through her cupped hands. Space isn't all it's cracked up to be. The thought caught in the back of Edie's throat and made her feel like crying. Then another much better thought popped into her head, and she giggled out loud with the fun of it, although the giggle came out all dry and soundless. She picked up one of the bags and walked unsteadily to the wall opposite the bed, where she had drawn her bookshelf and Captain Kirk. She selected a dark blue crayon that was almost complete and stood for a moment, judging the space and the approach. Where to start, how to proceed. There was no going back, really. Even on these smooth cement walls, it took ages to scrape mistakes off with a thumbnail. Edie's tongue poked out a little from between her lips, the way it always did when she was thinking really hard. She was thinking so hard that she had forgotten how dry she was. She didn't take long to decide. When it came, The idea was so perfect that she really only needed to step forward and reach out her arm and press the blunt point of the blue crayon against the wall. Then, with one big satisfying loop that sent a little thrill up the back of her neck, Edie Evans started to draw herself an escape hatch. Chapter 41. James couldn't remember the last time he had been this angry. He leaned hard on the heavy glass door to the police station and looked around, spoiling for a fight. There was a little window in one wall, like a tube station ticket office, and behind the window was a police officer. "I want to make a complaint," he said. "Yes, sir," said the woman. "What about?" "About some copper who's been bothering my wife." "Okay," said the officer, pulling a pad of plain paper towards her. "Can you give me your name, please?" James told her his name and his age and address, and the name of his wife. The officer tapped her pen on the paper for a moment. "And do you know the name of the officer involved, sir?" "Marvel," said James. She wrote it down, very slowly. "And what is the nature of your complaint, sir?" "This arsehole has been coming round my flat and forcing my wife to help him on a case. She's already stressed. My son is missing, and she's mentally not so great, you know. The last thing she needs is this prick coming round and making her do stuff that's making her worse." The officer nodded up at him. "I understand, sir. But please, could you watch your language? There's no call for it." "I'm sorry," said James. "I'm sorry. But I got home on Saturday night and my kitchen was flooded because my wife didn't know what she was doing, because this idiot had come round and upset her so much." "I understand, sir," nodded the woman. "I'm upset too," said James. "My wife's very fragile. She just doesn't need it. We don't need it. And I want something done. I don't want this man coming round again. I want him to leave us alone." "Absolutely, sir," she said. And James felt the tension starting to leave his body. The officer was very soothing, and now that he was calmer, he looked at her properly for the first time. She was young and attractive, with big, intelligent eyes that made him instinctively trust that she would do the right thing. "You take a seat, sir, and I'll see how I can help you with this, okay?" "Thank you," he said. "Do you want me to fill in a form or something?" "No, sir," she said. "You have a seat." There was a form to fill in, but Emily Aguda didn't give it to James Buck. She still might. Procedurally speaking, it was the right thing to do, and so she wasn't ruling it out. But she didn't want to do anything that couldn't be reversed. She got up from her desk at the window, met eyes with Sergeant Caxton, who would relieve her for 5 minutes, and left the office behind the window. She didn't go far. After going through the double doors into the corridor that led to the cells and the cafeteria, Aguda leaned against the wall and thought about everything she knew about Anna Buck and James Buck and the Edie Evans case. There wasn't a lot, but she figured every detail was important in the decision she had to make. For a start, Anna Buck was crazy. Mentally fragile was as kind as you could be about it. So Aguda reasoned from that James Buck was kind and loved his wife. And a man who loved his wife, even though she was crazy, couldn't be all bad, could he? Couldn't be a killer of children, surely. Certainly, she had gone to see Marvel about her suspicions over James Buck, but now that she had met him, albeit briefly, she thought those suspicions were probably wrong. After all, if Anna Buck's idea of a baby was that hideous thing with a battery heart, then her concerns over her husband's childcare skills were probably similarly skewed. James Buck could be Father of the Year, for all Aguda knew. But if he were a dangerous man, Aguda couldn't see how it would help the Edie Evans case or Anna Buck's lost son if the first official police contact with James Buck was in the form of a complaint. That would complicate everything, especially as Aguda had a feeling that it was a complaint that would be upheld. She had no doubt that Marvel had been round to James Buck's flat and had bothered the hell out of his wife. No doubt whatsoever. However good the reason, that was pretty outrageous behavior, and Aguda seriously doubted that Buck's complaint would be the first one that had ever been made against DCI Marvel. The man was too abrasive, too rude, too much of a prick to have escaped previous brushes with the disciplinary system. Thanks to her role as a glorified Force mascot, Aguda recognized that her opinion on all these scores was less scientific deduction and more feminine intuition. It wasn't something she was about to write up in a report, but it felt like common sense. And that was her favorite of all the senses. So she opened the door to the foyer and beckoned James Buck off the bench. She led him up to the second floor, past the drinks machine, through the Jenga, and to the desk in the far corner, and introduced him to a surprised-looking DCI John Marvel. Then she left. As her mother used to say, let nature run its course. Marvel and James Buck both looked a little embarrassed. Aguda had merely introduced one to the other and walked away, but she might as well have made them shake hands and told them to play nice. In awkward silence, they watched her leave. Then Buck said, "If you're Marvel, I came here to complain about you." "Yeah," said Marvel. He was angry with Aguda for bringing the man right to him, when his instinct was always to keep trouble as far away from himself as was humanly possible. Maybe she hadn't understood that this man had wanted to make a complaint about him, not to him. Idiot. But James Buck was here now, looking sullen, and Marvel would have to make the best of a bad job. He gestured to the empty chair at the next desk. "Have a seat," he said, "and complain away." Buck sat down angrily. "You came round my house and upset my wife." "I'm investigating a murder," said Marvel. "I'm allowed to do stuff like that." "Yeah," said James. "At 9 o'clock on a Saturday night? Don't tell me that's official." Marvel shrugged. "Justice never sleeps." "Maybe, but justice flooded my bloody kitchen." Marvel frowned. "I didn't flood your kitchen." "I get home and my wife's soaking wet in bed and the flat's ankle deep in bloody water." "I don't know anything about that," said Marvel. He decided not to tell James Buck about the several glasses of water he'd fetched for his wife, or about how he'd left her still gulping greedily from the kitchen tap. "All I know is that I went round there to ask for her help on a very serious matter." "What matter?" "The kidnap and possible murder of a child." "What would she know about that? Just because we lost our son doesn't make us bloody CSI Bickley." Marvel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't want to look like a fool, but he also didn't want this bozo taking his complaint any further. "Mr. Buck," he said, "are you aware that your wife claims to have some psychic power?" "Yeah." To Marvel's relief, Buck looked as uncomfortable as he himself felt about it, now that he was sober. "Do you believe it?" he asked. "Course not," said Buck. "It's mental, like something out of Harry Potter." "Exactly," said Marvel. "Exactly." For a second, they were on the same page. It was a shame Marvel had to turn it. "Except," he said, and opened his hands at James Buck, hoping the young man would jump at the opportunity to admit he secretly believed it after all. "Except what?" said Buck suspiciously. So Marvel sighed and told him about the photo of Edie Evans, and about the garden and the bicycle bell. James Buck stared at him as if he were mental too, which he'd started to wonder himself lately.
You saying you think she is psychic?
I'm just saying maybe, even subconsciously. She heard something from someone who knows something about the case.
He tailed off. It sounded so lame. Buck looked at his hands. Then he gazed around the squad room until his eyes settled on the wall behind Marvel's head.
Why have you got a photo of me up there?
Shit. Where? Said Marvel, even though he knew exactly where James Buck was looking. His Edie Evans montage. Buck stood up and leaned across the desk.
There, he said. One of me and one of Anna. What's that all about? Are we under suspicion or something?
No, said Marvel quickly. Those are just people who might be helpful on the case I'm investigating. Which is why I'm glad you've come in today, Mr. Buck.
Marvel was proud of the segue. It was pretty smooth. Not smooth enough. Buck peered more closely at the photos.
They're not good pictures, even.
Everyone was a bloody critic. Buck pointed at Richard Latham.
Who's that?
Marvel hesitated. He still had no hard evidence that Richard Latham was anything more than a fraud, and he was unlikely to find anything else now that Edie's case had been officially closed. It didn't mean he wouldn't try, even if it meant doing it in his own time. He would have to re-examine every bit of evidence by the light of Richard Latham. He'd have to comb through his interview in the file for inexplicable knowledge of Edie or her home, particularly her bedroom. But right now, all he knew for sure was that the man claimed that Edie was dead, and that he didn't want to talk about it.
He's a psychic who was called in when the girl first went missing.
Another loon,
snorted James and sat down. Marvel laughed, and the tension relaxed a little.
Did Anna help you? That way, then?
Marvel hesitated. Had she? Had the horror that had unfolded at Anna Buck's kitchen table helped him? Or had he been witness to madness? The kind of madness that, in another time, would have seen her in a straitjacket. Still might. He'd been drunk, of course, but it had all seemed so real. Watching Anna Buck go away into another place, another time. Maybe even another person. Begging for water through cracked lips, clawing at the walls as if she could pass through solid brick, curling into a fetal position of arid pain. All he had asked was how Edie had died. After she'd showed him, Marvel had left Anna Buck's home and reeled out of the flat and vomited onto the garage forecourt. Dropping to all fours so he wouldn't splash his trousers, he had vomited and spat and vomited again, his knees wet and his hair plastered to his forehead with sweat that had made him shudder all over. But he had been drunk. Not so drunk that anyone else would notice, not rolling, but drunk, after what felt like years of being dry. So he was careful in his reply to James Buck.
I don't know, he said. This kind of thing is hard to quantify.
Because it's bollocks, right?
Because it's bollocks, said Marvel.
And what about me?
Said James Buck warily, nodding at the photo on the wall.
How can I be helpful?
I don't know, said Marvel. Yet.
Buck looked at Edie on her bicycle.
Is that the girl?
Yes, said Marvel. That's Edie Evans.
Buck looked at the picture for a good long minute, then said softly,
Poor kid.
Yes,
said Marvel, and got up.
You want a coffee or something? He said.
Yeah, okay,
said James Buck.
2 sugars, please.
Marvel went to the machine. While he waited for it to rip him off in liquid form, he watched James Buck from across the room. Despite his own suspicious nature, nothing about the man made him suspicious. He just seemed like a bloke who'd come in to defend his wife. Even though he thought she was a loon, it was almost endearing. Endearing come stupid. Marvel wouldn't have done it. If Debbie had come home from work and told him she'd been talking to dead people, Marvel would have asked her to turn in her key. Not so James Buck. But he was glad now that Aguda had brought Buck up here, even if it had been by mistake. At least Marvel was pretty sure he wouldn't be filing a complaint now. He was almost as sure that James Buck couldn't be helpful to him in any way whatsoever. He carried the 2 cups back to his desk.
"What about our boy, then?" said Buck. "It's all very well us helping you with your case, but what about Daniel?"
Ah. Marvel reached into his top drawer and took out the photo of Daniel on the lion. He pinned it on the wall next to the others. "I took this out on a job with me," he said. "Nobody's forgotten about Daniel, Mr. Buck."
"Thanks,"
said Buck, and the mood in the room palpably relaxed.
"Did Anna do those?"
Buck nodded at the drawings, pinned between the photographs. "Yes," said Marvel. "She said they were visions." Buck sipped his coffee.
"Can I see them?"
"Sure." Marvel unpinned the 2 pieces of lined paper and laid them on the desk between them. The garden through the window, and the weird candelabra thing with 88 on it. "She saw the garden first," he explained, "and it turns out to be very like the view from Edie Evans's bedroom window."
"Yeah?"
said James Buck. "And this thing here that I thought was a flower, Anna said it was a bicycle bell, and we found it right there, hidden under the windowsill."
"Yeah?"
Buck seemed more interested this time.
"She painted huge circles on the walls of Daniel's room, too. Huge blue circles. Made a right mess."
Marvel nodded. He thought it best not to admit that he knew. "Did she say what they might be?" James Buck shook his head and frowned into his paper cup.
"There are noodles in this coffee."
"Yeah," said Marvel. "Sometimes they mix up the soup with the other things."
"Oh," said Buck. "Okay."
And he went on drinking it.
"What's this?"
"I don't know what that one is either," said Marvel. "It looks like a candlestick or something, with a number 88 on it." Buck picked the drawing up and held it as he sipped his soup. A splayed bottom, a long, kinked stem, branching out into a thick top with 2 things that could well have held candles. He turned it sideways. He turned it upside down. He looked at Marvel in surprise.
"I know what this is."
Marvel put down his cup. "What?" Buck frowned at the paper.
"But how the hell would she know?"
"Know what? What is it?" James looked at him, clear-eyed with confidence.
"It's the exhaust system on Mr. Knight's Audi TT."
Chapter 42.
"There's vomit on the bloody forecourt!"
Brian Pigeon slammed the door of the Alpha and sought out Ang, who was skulking across the workshop with his broom.
"There's vomit on the forecourt!" he shouted again. "I nearly drove right through it."
"Yes," said Ang, although he looked confused. For a start, he worked from the inside out every morning, and he hadn't seen the vomit yet. Also, he'd never heard the word vomit.
"Well, don't just stand there. Get a bucket."
"Yes," said Ang. "I know."
He looked around, but he didn't move. Brian Pigeon took out his phone and shook it at him.
"Jesus, Ang, are you going to clean up that mess outside, or am I going to call immigration?"
He hit the dial key.
"Shit, no," said Ang, and hurried towards the door with his broom.
"Not a broom, a bucket."
Someone answered the phone, and Brian Pigeon said, "Hello, immigration?" Ang ran back to the kitchen for a bucket so fast that Brian Pigeon almost choked laughing. "Hello? Hi, yes, sorry about that. Brian Pigeon in Bickley here. Listen, auto lifts should be delivering this week. Are you ready to roll when I call?" He stopped as Ang passed him with a bucket and a roll of polishing cloth that cost £4 a metre. "What are you doing? Jesus Christ, what a complete moron!" "Sorry, not you. I'll call you back." He tossed the phone down on the workbench and steamed towards Ang Nu, who didn't know what he'd done wrong this time. Marvel studied Anna Buck's drawings as they drove to the garage. Of course, now that he thought the candlestick was actually an exhaust system, it was obvious. The splayed bottom was the engine manifold, combining smoothly into one pipe and running almost straight to the big square silencer at the back of the car. The bits he had thought were candle holders were exhaust pipes. The number 88 was apparently the letters BB. Buck said they stood for the makers of the custom exhaust, Billy Boat. And the 4 circles must be an Audi logo. It all made sense now, in a nonsensical kind of way. D.S. Brady drove. He'd been nervous about coming at first, because of the case having been closed. But when Marvel had shown him the drawing and explained the new lead, he'd been too excited to say no. Now Marvel twisted the rear-view mirror away from Brady so he didn't have to turn around to speak to James Buck. "Do you know this, Mr. Knight?" "Only from the garage. He's rich, bit of a dick." "And you don't know where he lives? We could go straight there." Buck shook his head and stared out of the rain-spattered window at row after row of small, cheap shops selling dusty cake tins, second-hand furniture, and other people's jewellery. "Not around here," he snorted. James had caught the bus to the police station, but the ride home was a lot quicker. That was good. He needed to speak to Anna about the drawing. He was sure he was right. He had admired that exhaust as it hung over his head on the lift in the workshop. Mikey had called him over to have a look at it, because the whole thing was chromed, and was the cleanest thing James had ever seen under a car. Billy Boat made exhausts for a range of top-line cars, each distinct from the other. And James remembered thinking that this single exhaust unit probably cost more than he could have earned in 2 months. So he was sure he was right, even without the BB insignia that confirmed that Anna hadn't just drawn a weird, coincidental shape. How could she know what Mr. Knight's exhaust looked like from underneath the car? She sat outside the garage all the time, but she didn't come in. He needed to speak to her. He would be able to soon. The shops became their local shops, the newsagent, the play school, the florist. The car stopped across the road from the garage. James could see Ang scrubbing the forecourt in the drizzle. For a moment he thought he was cleaning the 5 footprints, but then realized he was a few yards from there. "Wait here a minute," said Marvel, and got out with the sergeant. James had no choice. The back doors were locked. He watched Marvel and Brady stride purposefully across the road, their coats flapping around them in the bitter wind. "Oi," one of them said. James couldn't see who, and the sound was too muffled to tell from inside the car with the windows up. Ang looked up at the 2 men bearing down on him, and even from 15 yards away James could see the expression on his face turn from mild interest to fear, as he scrambled to his feet holding the bucket and started to back away. "Shit!" James yanked at the locked door again and then dived over the front seats in a desperate scramble to get out. Even as he opened the door, James saw Ang hurl the bucket at Marvel. Then he turned and ran. If he hadn't run, they wouldn't have chased him. Marvel and Brady had no reason to chase Ang Nu, other than getting a bucket of something thrown at them. They weren't there officially, and they weren't there for him. And if Brady hadn't been there too, hurtling after the kid like he was storming Goose Green, Marvel would have given up before they even reached the garage door. But Ang Nu did run, and Brady was there. Brady chased the kid and Marvel chased Brady, at a distance, through the garage, between cars with their bonnets open and under cars with their wheels off, past a tall, skinny man who observed them with unsurprised eyes, and a tubby man yelling, "What the hell is going on? I'm calling the fucking police." "We are the police," shouted Marvel. "I didn't call you," the man shouted furiously, looking around. "Where's my fucking phone?" A radio blared pop as Marvel ran into a dead end where there was nothing but an inspection pit filled with junk and an old mattress. Shit! He turned round and shouted into the face of a pale-skinned man with white hair and eyelashes. "Where's the back door?" The man took his own sweet time pointing, and Marvel jabbed a finger at him and said, "I'll be back for you, Whitey," like he was a Terminator, not an out-of-shape 45-year-old, panting and blowing. "You'll have a fucking heart attack first, fatty," shouted the man as Marvel banged his way through the back door and into the alleyway behind Northborough Road. Brady and the kid were nowhere to be seen. Thank Christ. Marvel slowed to a brisk walk and headed past the back of Anna Buck's flat. Walled yards on one side, high railway railings on the other. Marvel stopped and leaned on the wall and pressed a hand into his side to stave off a stitch. His head pounded and his mouth was dry in a way that reminded him of Anna last night, curled on the floor. He should really lose some weight. Debbie was killing him with culinary kindness. He should walk the dog, get fit. His breathing slowed, his heart rate steadied, his side stopped aching. A small electronic beep made Marvel turn his head. The Chinese kid was clambering out of the skip behind Tigger Time. While he still had one leg over the edge, Marvel rushed him. He nearly got him. At the last moment the boy saw him coming and hurled himself backwards, away from Marvel and out of the other side of the skip. He hit the ground with a grunt, but was up like lightning, and by the time Marvel had crossed the 4 paces between them, he was off and running again. This time Marvel had to run fast. There was nobody else to rely on. He did his best to keep his arms moving and breath passing in and out of his lungs. It was agony. He could see that the alleyway ended 50 yards ahead, a merciful dead end created by the rising wall of Bickley Bridge, where he'd first met Anna Buck. It's all circles. The boy reached the wall and stopped and turned to see how close Marvel was. "Hold it right there," shouted Marvel, and for 1 second he could see in the kid's eyes that he just might do that. Then Brady shouted and burst out of a yard somewhere behind Marvel, and the boy hurled himself at the steel railway fence and started to climb. Marvel got there just in time to grab his foot, but the boy kicked out at him so hard that his phone fell from his pocket and his shoe came off in Marvel's hand. Then he toppled over the top of the fence and dropped into the grass and brambles and litter on the other side. For a second, their eyes met through the railings. "So sorry," panted the boy, pleading. "So sorry." Then Brady hit the fence beside Marvel with a rattle and went over it, and the boy turned and ran again, this time along the steep bank beside the tracks. Marvel got a bad feeling, a sudden dread. "Stop!" he yelled. "Brady! Stop!" Brady did, and so did the boy. He stopped and half-turned to see what was happening, pivoted on one toe. The overflow of momentum took him back a step. The drop was steep, and when he put his foot down behind him, the ground wasn't where it should have been. 1 minute he was standing, looking at them, arms still swinging around his body with the energy of the chase. The next, he had tumbled backwards down the bank and out of sight. Shit! Marvel waited for the sound of a train to complete the horror, but there was nothing. He tested the railings in his fists, and with a deep grunt, pulled himself up and over them. Sweat sprung up on his face at the unaccustomed effort. He got his coat snagged at the top and half jumped, half fell onto the other side, accompanied by a loud ripping noise. He got to his feet unsteadily. "Where is he?" he yelled at Brady. Brady turned towards him and pointed down the bank. "There!" A few feet from the fence, the ground fell away steeply, so Marvel approached cautiously. Ang Nu had not had that luxury. At the foot of the embankment, abutting the brickwork of the bridge, was a wrought-iron fan of Victorian railings, made to keep children and the homeless out of the short tunnel. Today its sharp points had broken a homeless child's fall. One had speared Ang Nu's buttock, another protruded from his chest. A third had gone straight through his skull and right eye. The smell of old death rose up to meet them, as if Ang Nu's life had already ended here, a long, long time ago. Marvel said nothing, and neither did Brady. There was too much not to say. Chapter 43. Brady boosted Marvel back over the fence. His coat caught again on the top, but it was already torn. It smelled of vomit, too, which made him remember the bucket the kid had chucked at him, and how hard he'd tried not to throw up on himself after leaving Anna Buck's flat last night. He shouldn't have bothered. It had got him in the end. He turned the boy's shoe over with his toe and picked up the phone. The shoe was an Adidas knockoff with a hole in the heel. The phone was quite new. Marvel left Brady at the embankment to keep rubberneckers at bay and walked slowly back to the garage, like a kid reluctant to go home for a hiding. They weren't even supposed to be here. Clyde had closed the case. He was supposed to be charging Richard Latham for dog-napping or arresting some other bastard for shooting Tansy Anderson. Anything but this. Here. Now. He was in deep shit. By the time he got back to the garage, the tall, skinny mechanic and the short, white, curly one had both vanished. "Where's Ang?" said James Buck. "What's his name?" "Ang Nu." "Why'd he fucking run?" Marvel complained, making the victim into the culprit with a single short question. "You scared him. He thought you were immigration." "He's not legal, then?" Marvel was slightly cheered. That was good news. The kid was an illegal immigrant. Chasing down a guilty man was a whole different matter. A guilty man was fair game. Why he was guilty was beside the point. Marvel looked around. "Where did the other two go?" "I dunno." "They legal?" Buck reddened, and his eyes flickered towards the tubby man, whose slicked-back hair and blue overalls made him look like Chairman Mao. "You the boss?" said Marvel. "Yes." "What's your name?" "Brian Pigeon." "Well, you're in deep shit, Mr. Pigeon." It was nice to pass it on. The man in the overalls didn't even bother asking why, just looked worried. "Where's Ang?" James Buck insisted. "Little shit took my phone," said Pigeon. "Right here off the bench." "Ang's dead," said Marvel. "Dead?" said James. He and Pigeon exchanged stunned looks. "What happened?" "He fell." "What? How?" Marvel sighed and answered him out of courtesy for his help and for not making a complaint. Yet. "Look, your colleague fell while trying to evade arrest, and sadly is deceased. The important thing now is to take care of matters in an appropriate manner." "Did he have family here?" Buck shook his head, looking sick, and Brian Pigeon answered, "No, nobody." More music to Marvel's ears. Nobody was going to make a fuss about Ang Nu. Nobody was going to cry to the newspapers. Nobody was going to call for his head or sue the Met. "Where did he live?" he asked. Buck glanced at Brian Pigeon, who said, "Here. He lived here. He couldn't afford rent, so I let him stay here." "Anything to do with the fact that you're employing a bunch of illegal immigrants?" Pigeon said nothing more. Marvel pointed a firm finger at him. "You're under arrest," he said. "Don't go anywhere." The next several hours were a blur of ambulances, flapping crime scene tape, news crews, transport police, rail track PR suits, and scenes of crime officers in white jumpsuits. Clyde himself made an appearance and gave a statement to TV reporters on the garage forecourt before telling Marvel to go home. "But this is my case,"
Marvel had said defiantly. "This isn't your case," Clyde had replied coldly. "You don't have a case. As of right now, you don't even have a job." When Marvel had looked blank, he'd added, "You're suspended." Later, as Marvel got as drunk as he possibly could, in the warm embrace of the King's arms, he watched the story play out on the TV over the bar. Behind Clyde's fake sorrow for Ang Nu, he could see Brian Pigeon being led away from the garage in handcuffs. And beyond that was what looked like a small blue tent pitched on the edge of the forecourt. He thought the Sockos might have erected it over the place where he'd vomited the night before. Then, just before the shot cut to the railway embankment, the little tent moved, and he realized it was a person sitting there, in a big blue nylon something. When it moved, he saw it was Anna Buck, a skinny blur, head bowed, legs like sticks. Marvel suddenly realized the irony of seeking help on a missing persons case from someone who couldn't even find her own bloody kid. He ordered another Jameson, another double. Marvel finally got home a little after midnight, bloodshot and exhausted, to find that the coffee table had gone. So had the Habitat sofa. "Debbie!" he shouted. So had Debbie. "Buster!" he said loudly. "Buster!" There was no clatter of tiny feet. There was an envelope with his name on it, taped to the TV screen, with something that left a mark when he ripped it off. He knelt and scratched at the gummy mess, until he woke up with his forehead pressed against the dark screen and drool on his chin. The sofa may have gone, but luckily the rug was still there, so he lay down on it. It was only as he fell into the wonderful, dreamless sleep of the hopelessly drunk that John Marvel remembered that the exhaust system on the Audi TT had not yet been checked. But by then, it didn't seem that important. Edie Evans cried without tears. She made the face and a tiny humming sound. She hoped her body's own memory might muster some moisture to ease the gritty blinking of her lids. When it didn't, she closed her eyes instead, to keep them from turning to little husks in their sockets. Her bed floated in the dark. The escape hatch that had invited her through the wall and into the blackness had repeated and widened in inexorable circles as she passed slowly into the beyond, until the walls were dark with escape. There was nothing left now of Edie's bedroom and books and Peter the Mouse, and there was nothing left of the crayons but what was under her nails. Every last sliver of brown, blue, black wax had been pressed against the cement with her thumb. Every bumpy smear had obliterated her life and opened her eyes to other possibilities. The view of the garden had been the last thing to go. She missed it. She missed it. Now, as Edie lay curled and crisping on the bed, her hand flinched with independent desire to reach up and scratch away the dark wax and to uncover that memory once more. She tightened her fist to keep it by her side. Her past was gone, and trying to find it again would only make this harder. Now, Edie prepared to accept her future. Chapter 44. Anna and James Buck had breakfast together the next morning, for the first time since Daniel had disappeared. Neither of them ate, although Anna made toast, but they sat at the table with mugs of tea and sipped them together, bonded by a tragedy that was even more immediate than the loss of their son.
"What will you do today?"
said Anna.
James shrugged. "As much as I can, I suppose. Brian's sure to be back soon. His wife will bail him out."
She nodded. "Poor Ang," she said. James nodded. "I wish I knew where to send his stuff." Ang's possessions lay on the table between them. The story cloth, a wire horse in the making, a carved wooden mask with small mouth, big teeth and wide eyes, the bottle of gold. Anna slowly unwound the cloth. "He told me his mother made that," said James. Anna ran her finger over the raised stitching, tracing the walls of petals and the spiral shells of snails. She bit her lip and said, "Now she'll never know what happened to him." James reached out and touched the back of Anna's hand. After a moment, she turned it over so he could hold it. DCI John Marvel, suspended, woke with a mouth like an old sock. He was still on the rug in front of the TV, and that gummy mark was still on the screen. Debbie had known it would infuriate him. That's why she'd done it, of course. He smelled vomit and turned his head to look at the rug on either side of him, then realized it was him. He was still wearing his coat. He rolled onto his side with the intention of rising, and winced as something in his pocket dug hard into his left buttock. He got unsteadily to all fours, and from there to his knees. His head was a medicine ball full of bees. He needed a drink. He put his hand in his pocket and found Ang Nu's phone. Bollocks. He'd have to call Brady now to come and take it in for evidence. Suspended. Shit. He'd never even come close before. He'd had a few run-ins with arseholes in senior positions, but nothing like this. Never chased someone to their death. In his other pocket he found his cigarettes and his lighter. Without rising from his knees, he lit one and felt a bit better. By the time he was halfway done, he thought he might be able to make it to the chair. It wasn't a comfortable chair, but it was all there was, and it wasn't the floor. So Marvel shuffled over to it on his knees with his big head lolling and buzzing. He hauled himself up onto the seat, like a man who's been tipped out of his wheelchair, then sat there for a moment, getting his breath back around the cigarette. He took the phone out of his pocket again and stared at the little screen. He fiddled idly until he found the contacts list, but it was empty. He put it down on the side table, but it fell on the floor, which was when he realized Debbie had taken the side tables too. He sighed and stubbed his cigarette out on the arm of the chair, then lit another one. He thought of Ang Nu, draped over the fan of spikes like a magic show illusion. He thought of the moment before that, when he'd grabbed his warm ankle as he went up the fence. If he hadn't stopped in the alleyway to press a hand into his stitch, he'd have run straight past Ang Nu just the way Brady had. The boy would have slithered over the lip of the skip behind him and run out onto Northborough Road. Disappeared, survived. It would have been annoying, but it would have been better than this. Suspended. Dumped. Debbie had dumped him. He hadn't seen that one coming. Although now he thought about it, he wondered if he should have. The envelope with his name on it was still there, unopened, on the floor next to the TV. He didn't think he'd bother reading it. He had no interest in a litany of his shortcomings. Marvel smoked for a bit and brooded. Then he remembered the small beeping noise that had alerted him to Ang Nu's presence in the skip yesterday. He leaned out of the chair and fumbled around on the floor for the phone. He pressed the dial key. That was the beep he'd heard. He pressed the stop key. It was the same sound. Marvel took a long drag on his cigarette and thought about things. Ang Nu had called somebody. While he was crouched in a skip filled with toys and crayons and old powder paints, being chased by the police, the boy had made a phone call. All Marvel had heard was him pressing the key to end it. Who the hell did he call? He had no family. And if it had friends, Marvel imagined he'd have been living with them instead of in that tiny shithole of a workshop kitchen. Who would someone like Ang Nu call in his hour of need? A solicitor? A taxi? A hitman? He pressed the dial key again and peered at the screen to read the last number dialed. Marvel had to hold the phone further away and pull his head back on his shoulders to read the landline number, but it meant nothing to him. He hit dial once more and winced, his eyes closed, while he listened to the great clanging of the ringtone. "Blue Circle Cement, can I help you?" Marvel hung up. He stared at the phone. The cigarette burned down until his fingers got hot. He stared at the phone. Blue circles on the wall of Anna Buck's bedroom. The sound of the radio seeping through the walls. What was it she'd said? "Sometimes I hear him crying." Chasing Brady, chasing Ang through the garage, almost falling into the inspection pit, from where a person would have the perfect view of a Billy boat exhaust on an Audi TT. Marvel was so drunk, he drove. And as he drove, he hit dial again. "Blue Circle This is Detective Chief Inspector Marvel from Lewisham Police. Have you got a job booked at Pigeon's Garage in Bickley?" There was a pause, while someone decided whether it was a prank call. Then she said, "Yes, why?" "What is it?" Filling in an inspection pit." "When?" There was a suspicious beat. "Can I ask what this is about, please?" "No, you bloody can't," he shouted. "When is the job? When?" An offended silence. And then the woman said, "Now." Chapter 45. "Open the door. Open the door." Edie watched the door through the smallest of slits in her eyelids. Even that hurt. Everything hurt. Her empty tummy, her ripped fingernails, her raw, swollen lips and tongue and throat. She had stopped trying to swallow when one got stuck halfway like a lump of coal, and only slowly relaxed. Next time she might not be so lucky. Her lips had stuck together, and she didn't try to tear them apart. Her nostrils were so dry they bled now and then, but she barely noticed any more. She drifted between sleep and this, whatever this was. She hoped it wasn't death, because death should be better than this. All she knew was it was always a blow to wake up and find herself still in this tiny room. "Open the door. Open the door." She saw it happening. 1,000 times she heard the bolt click. She saw the door swing open onto the black velvet sky, and the diamond pinpricks of other worlds guiding her home. Edie Evans hoped she was in space. Otherwise, dying seemed like such a waste.